Well, folks, it has finally happened. It has been announced that President Donald Trump has signed an executive order to eliminate federal funding for the National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, citing that there is biased and partisan news coverage. So this executive order is going to target the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds roughly 1,500 public radio and news stations. Now, obviously, this ignites a pretty big debate over the role that public media like this should play in America. There's a lot of questions around it. Should public media like NPR, like PBS, be pushing radical left-wing causes? Look, I have no issue at base level. I have no issue with a public broadcasting service. I don't. I simply don't. I think that it's okay. I think it might actually could be good, especially for emergency situations, and for a lot of different situations, to have a publicly funded news network, broadcasting network. I think that's okay. But I think there has to be journalistic integrity. You have to have integrity. You cannot be pushing the radical left-wing narratives that PBS and NPR have been pushing for 50 years, especially the last 10 years. It's gotten really bad because, NPR and PBS are America's primary public broadcasting networks. They're similar to like the BBC in the UK or the CBC in Canada, but they do have a distinct funding and organizational structure where they do get relatively a decent amount of money from the United States government through the CPB, or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which that CPB was established back in, I believe, 1967. It was established, 1967. It was established, and it's a nonprofit that was created by Congress to distribute federal funds to public media. Now, in 2025, the CPB received roughly $250 million, so about $535 million from Congress, that supposedly is supposed to go to support local stations nationwide. NPR says they receive about 1% of their budget directly from federal funds, while PBS gets closer to about 15% of their funds from the federal government. Now, local stations, especially in rural areas, do rely on these CPB grants for roughly up to 50% of their budget in certain areas. And public media serves over 99% of Americans, provide news, emergency alerts, educational content. But here's the issue. I'm okay having this. But when you're going to push these left-wing radical, crazy stuff. For example, NPR in 2024 published a Valentine's Day segment where NPR discussed, quote, queer animals that suggested that animals like clownfish, banana slugs, and deer exhibited non-binary and queer behavior. Like, excuse me? If you want to push that radical BS, go ahead, push it, but you're not going to do it. I don't care if you receive a dime or $250,000 or $250 million from the United States government or from the federal government. You should not get a penny if you're going to be pushing radical left-wing ideology like this that promote racial gender ideology. It is 100% inappropriate to use taxpayer funds for these fringe cultural narratives. NPR, there's a whole list. The other big one was in 2022, NPR ran a story about how a community of, quote, genderqueer dinosaur enthusiasts, and they coined the term transceratops. And people like Brendan Gill, who's a Republican representative, questioned whether this was a legitimate use of public funds. This is activism. This is not journalism. This is activism. This is clearly pushing a radical ideology. And of course, PBS, NPR, they're going to say, oh, they can't do this. And I don't care. I don't care what we do. We should do anything we can to strip funding away from them. And then with PBS, they had a segment in 2021 was a Let's Learn Drag incident where they featured a drag queen called, quote, Lil Miss Hot Mess in a promotional content for the children's program Let's Learn. It was evidence that PBS was pushing sexualized content towards children. And NPR is going to say that they offer a diverse perspective. When was the last time that you heard a coverage from a news story that was even remotely friendly towards a conservative? Remotely. My issue is when they get super super big into the racial and social justice narratives. In 2024, PBS produced a documentary that advocated for reparations for racial injustices, which we know it is a left-wing policy. There was no counter argument to it. It was just solely that we need reparations. Even though I never did anything that affected a minority, and the people who are living today were never affected by that. NPR also had a story in 2024 about systematic racism, and this is the issue. I'm okay having a discussion about systematic racism, but when they try and frame it as it's just a fact, I'm okay talking about systematic racism. If there is a system, an institution out there where there is clearly a racist law, a racist rule on the books, I'm here to fight with you to get that off the books. I don't want that. If there is clearly evidence of systematic racism, I want to fight that with you together. No doubt. But ultimately, to just say that it is a given, to offer it as a fact, the way they're going to frame it as a fact, it's the default lens that they're going to look at things through. It's an assumption. These are progressive assumptions that they are making, which is totally ridiculous. And, we know that NPR's newsroom has 87 registered Democrats and 0 registered Republicans. So, even on an ideological balance, there's 87 Democrats who write for their newsroom in Washington. And there are 0 Republicans. There is 0. I say, you want your money, there needs to be ideological diversity. 100%. 100%. It's a complete joke. And then you look at everything they covered up. They covered up the Hunter Biden story. NPR refused to cover the New York Post report that Hunter Biden's laptop had many, red flags inside of it. They claimed it was a distraction, including, there was tons of people said it was deliberately avoiding the story because it would be damaging to Democrats. That's what they did. They suppressed the COVID-19 lab leak hypothesis. They published multiple articles dismissing the lab leak theory as unlikely or conspiratorial, even though the FBI, CIA, and Department of Energy later deemed it plausible. NPR was criticized for not covering its stance. I'm okay, cover both sides. Why can't we cover both sides? Why does it have to be right or left? Why can't we just have a news organization like NPR or PBS that's going to just cover one side? That's all I'm looking for. That is literally all we are looking for right here. And there's a complete imbalance even in the language. PBS uses the term far right. In 2024, they did a study. PBS used the word far right 162 times or in 2024. But at the same time, they only used the term far left 6 times. There was a conservative watchdog group that claimed that 72% of PBS's Republican National Convention coverage was negative. Meanwhile, 88% of the Democrat National Convention coverage was positive. How much more evidence do we need to show you that they are a partisan organization? If you want to be partisan, go do it yourself. Don't rely on funding from the federal government. Why do you have to rely on taxpayers to promote your radical left-wing ideology? The Young Turks find a way to do it by themselves, but they're actually kind of sane half the time over at the Young Turks. Half the time, not all the time. Now, there is a lot of discussion whether this is even legal. Is this something that can even be done? Trump signed the executive order yesterday, which was to, quote, cease federal funding for NPR and PBS to the maximum extent allowed by law. It also prohibits local stations from using CPB grants to support NPR or PBS programming, aiming to sever indirect funding as well. Now, Trump justified the order by claiming NPR and PBS exhibit left-wing biases, which is true, that taxpayer-funded media undermines journalistic independence. If you're going to have state-run media, you need to cover both sides equally. And the order aligns with a broader push from Republicans and conservatives, which to include a proposed $1 billion cut to CPB's funding in a recession in a package to Congress. NPR and PBS do argue that the order is, quote, unlawful, as the 1967 Public Broadcasting Act insulates CPB from presidential control, stating that no federal official can direct its funding. And the CPB itself sued the White House after Trump attempted to remove 3 out of the 5 board members, which just show there's a lot of tension going on between the two entities right now. And defunding public media has been a Republican goal since like the 60s, since Richard Nixon. And it was a clear goal in different policy, Republican and conservative policy blueprints, explicitly calling for cuts to the CPB. In a recent GOP-led congressional hearing, have targeted NPR and PBS over their alleged liberal bias, though nothing has been put into legislation yet to stop this. We're hoping in the appropriations package that will have to be passed at the end of the year, we will see something here. Now, like we said, NPR CEO Catherine Maher warns that defunding it could devastate rural stations. Well, how about this? How about you stop pushing radical liberal bullcrap and you wouldn't have to worry about it? You wouldn't. Because, yeah, we want to have it. We want to have public broadcasting. But at the end of the day, if you're just going to push, how about this? How about you fire half of your journalists and hire conservatives? Hire 83 or 43 or 44 conservatives to be on your staff. Because there's a lot of good things that PBS does. Warning systems, response networks, emergency services, especially when cell phones go out, and in a system that could be at risk without the funding. But also, if you're going to use those same airwaves to promote radical leftism, then you don't get money. It is as simple as that. You have a First Amendment right, but when you're being funded by the federal government, you don't. You don't get to say whatever you want. You need to be unbiased. Get off the payroll. If you're off the payroll, you can do whatever you want. Because we need to end this propaganda machine that's been funded by the deep state, the liberals, for decades now. And this is something, like we said, it needs to be done right now. But Trump's executive order does mark a bold escalation in this fight. We finally have a president with a pair of balls. Finally, who's willing to do this. And this is going to be fought out in the courts. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. But this will be fought in the courts. There will be legal hurdles. And the outcome is going to shape a lot because there's a lot of people who get news this way. But it's really going to be the liberals who are going to be devastated because ultimately, how many conservatives actually listen to that BS? But this is just the beginning of that battle. So let me know. Let me know your thoughts down below. Is this something you support? Is this something you not support? I'd love to know what your thoughts on everything is down below in the comments. As always, drop down below, hit that subscribe button, and we'll catch you next time, folks.